Hello. Welcome to this SRA webinar on anti-money laundering, reporting concerns and suspicious activity. My name is Mark Boyle, and I am the AML Policy Manager for the SRA, and I'll be chairing today's event. Joining me today will be Andrew Bryan, who is the AML Policy Associate for the SRA. Andrew has been at the SRA for 2 years and has previously worked for national and regional law firms in the UK. He specialized in anti-money laundering for a decade and has also worked in the investment banking and consumer credit industries. Joining us today also is Khurram Javed, who is the UK FIU Reporter Engagement Manager. Khurram is the engagement manager for the UK Financial Investigative Unit, or the UK FIU as it's better known, within the NCA. The UK FIU has the national responsibility to receive and analyse suspicious activity reports, or SARs as they're also known, extracting strategic and tactical intelligence and disseminating SARs to the appropriate organisations for investigation. With experience in operational management, compliance and financial intelligence, he's previously held positions with the Ministry of Justice and Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. So welcome to both. Today they'll be speaking for about 20 minutes on reporting anti-money laundering concerns to us, to the SRA, and also making suspicious activity reports to the NCA. This webinar will give insight and guidance around common issues with SARs, as well as how to make sure your reports are as effective as possible. Just a note to say that we have allowed some time at the end to answer your questions, so please do pop those in the chat. I would encourage you to submit some live questions using the link at the bottom of the page. We're always keen to hear your questions. Even if we may not get to answer them on the call, we'll still take them away, and they're very useful food for thought as well when we think about future guidance. One other point to say is this is the latest in our series of free AML webinars. So I would just like to encourage people to check our events page for future events. The next AML webinar, I think, is likely to be in the new year. And upcoming topics include ones on firm-wide risk assessments, source of funds, and our thematic project on the role of the MLCO and MLRO. So I'm going to stop speaking now. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Andrew to begin. Andrew, please.
Thanks very much, Mark. So today we're going to be talking about what is on screen. We'll be touching on reporting AML concerns or breaches of the regulations. We'll be talking about how the UK Financial Intelligence Unit works with suspicious activity reports. We'll be talking about the value of SARs in the real world and the ingredients of a good quality SAR, and also some SAR success stories. So to move on to reporting concerns. So as you will well know, for breaches of our standards and regulations, for any factual matters you reasonably believe are capable of amounting to a serious breach of our regulatory arrangements, that you must report these to us. And that's in our code for individuals and our code for firms. This also extends to anti-money laundering, and we would expect things to be reported to us concerning repeated or intentional breaches of the money laundering regulations or systemic breaches associated with a failure of policies or procedures and facilitation of business activities which bear the hallmarks of money laundering activity and actually, facilitate crime. So further on reporting concerns, there are two channels to highlight to us, to report to us where you have concerns, and those are report@sra.org.uk, our email address, and also our Red Alert hotline. If you have a look online, there's guidance on breach seriousness as well to guide whether to report to us or not. It's also important that you advise whether you wish for the report to be handled confidentially to enable us to protect reporters and progress any investigations with sensitivity. It's also important to highlight that money laundering breaches are distinct from reports of suspicion, which should always be reported through SARS Online via your own money laundering reporting officer or MLRO. So with that, I will now hand over to Khurram to start exploring suspicious activity reporting. Over to you, Khurram.
Thanks, Andrew. So looking at SARs from the legal sector, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that the general quality of SARs from the legal sector is improving. So a big thank you from the UK FIE for your efforts at what you're putting into the SAR. With an 8% rise in reporting from 2019 to 2020, I think we acknowledge that there is work for the UK FIU to do to maintain that level of quality and indeed gain further improvements. And we do have plans to do so. For example, this year, this presentation is just part of the series of webinars we'll be delivering across the UK FIU to help the legal sector get the quality of their SARs right, which ultimately translates to tangible benefits for the UK FIU. We do get over 500,000 SARs per year, and while it's not for the UK FIU to make any assessment about the level of reporting from the legal sector, our DIP sampling shows that the more reports we're getting, the better the quality of those reports, and therefore the positive correlation suggests a better understanding of when to file a SAR, in my opinion. And why is it so important? I think we have to look at the cost of money laundering here. So the value of SARs is far-reaching, in my opinion. The cost of money laundering is estimated to sit at just shy of 37 billion through the UK economy. Last year, with 500,000 SARs, over 172 million was denied to suspected criminals resulting from defence against money laundering alone. More than 100 million of that was denied when there was no previous or existing law enforcement interest. And it's really important to recognise that neither of these figures represent the totality of law enforcement impacts, which is very likely to be significantly higher. And equally, with over £37 billion being laundered, we know the opportunities are there for further action, which is why you on the front line are so important in helping us understand where the risks are and when the money laundering is occurring in your SARs. And then we move on to discuss what the role of the UK FIU actually is with the SARs that you submit. Like Mark said very early on, the UK FIU has a mandate to receive SARs. We analyse them and then we disseminate them to local law enforcement, either both domestic or international law enforcement where appropriate. This is because SARs are a critical intelligence resource for tackling money laundering, terrorism, and serious and organised crime. Our analytical input has also increased this year to provide greater cross-matching and identify typologies. So what do we actually do in layman's terms? Well, we get your SAR, we break it down for value, we look at some checks across various databases to understand the underlying picture of the transaction, and then we assess whether law enforcement partners could take action by disseminating that SAR in the strictest of confidence. I think the value of SARs, in my opinion, is that it can be used over and over again, which is where SARs demonstrate value. And it's not always about the money, in my opinion. For example, in recent cases, SARs intelligence was instrumental in locating sex offenders, murder suspects, and showing the movement of young women being trafficked into the UK to work in the sex industry. Some SARs give us a chance to respond immediately, and others are longer-term investigative operations that are enhanced for impact. There's so many uses for the data, which is why I say the value is far-reaching. So if you're hesitating on what's the point, please consider that the intelligence value may be greater than it appears on face value. We'll move on to discuss how multiple SARs in the same subject or company can identify new targets and the value. Like I said, some give us a chance to respond immediately, but most intelligence that we get helps us enhance existing or future operations. And the more SARs we have on a subject, the better we can understand the picture for money laundering, which is again why I say, if you're hesitating, please don't. If you have a suspicion, please report it. We won't act immediately on your SAR. We'll probably piece it together with multiple other pieces of intelligence before we consider any action. But it really does enhance the picture of the intelligence we're seeing. And again, intelligence isn't just in one form of SAR. So moving on to discuss the types of SARs that we get, you have a required SAR, which is SARs made by financial institutions and other professionals, such as solicitors, accountants, and estate agents. We have things such as DAML SARs. So a DAML is a request for money laundering, a defence or request for money laundering, where you believe the property that you're intending on dealing with is in some way criminal, and it gives you a defence to do so. It also gives the UK FIU an opportunity to actively disrupt money laundering. And this is where you either get a decision from us telling you can go ahead with the transaction, or telling you actually we're not providing you the defence, which means you cannot proceed with that transaction. And then that allows us to pursue the transaction in slow time. And finally, you've got something called a defence against terrorist financing SAR, which is very similar to a defence against money laundering SAR, in just that the situation applies to funds that are believed to be terrorist finance rather than money laundering. and the obligation to report that comes under the Terrorism Act 2000. All of this information is explained quite deeply in our SARS FAQ, which I believe my colleagues will share after this call. But if you have any further questions on this, please do refer to our guidelines. We've issued a number of publications on the NCA website, and you're more than welcome to have a look. And I think before I hand back to Andrew, we'll just talk about why your SAR might be a vital piece of the puzzle. I really want to stress, when considering the value of what you're reporting, just remember that your SAR could be really vital in locating a potential offender. Just recently, we had a case where police were searching for a subject believed to have committed a serious sexual assault against a female member of the public, and there was no intelligence held in any police databases. The final database available to them was through the UK FIU, and they'd received training from us on how to exploit the data. And when they were able to search, they found not only a name and a telephone number, but an address which allowed the subject to be apprehended. So I think the point that I still want to stress is, if you're ever unsure about whether your SAR has any intelligence value, it's more than likely it does have, maybe not for the purpose you think it did, but it certainly helps us build a picture. And with that, I'll hand back to Andrew.
Thanks very much, Karim. So let's get into best practice for submitting a SAR. So the things you can see on screen are the things that should really be in there. So this slide mostly concerns the detailed pages before the narrative section of SARS Online. So the NCA have emphasised that it's important to enter as many identifying details as possible into these pages that form part of a SAR submission. These could be details such as phone numbers, bank details, or even company numbers and email addresses of the narrative. All of this information enters a database where the information rests for 6 years. This data could at any time be drawn upon as useful intelligence for a law enforcement investigation. So further on best practice, for similar database scanning purposes, the NCA requests that you enter unknown in the fields where you don't have information, or where you might have partial information, like half a passport number from a cut-off photocopy, for example. Entering unknown clearly indicates that you don't have the information, where leaving it blank may lead to inquiries from the FIU asking whether you actually have the information. If the transaction involves other firms or professional service providers you are working with on a matter, please include their details too in the narrative, and this might lead to law enforcement contacting them separately as well as part of an investigation. So on details required, complete all the info fields if you can. Names, dates of birth, and include account numbers, as I mentioned. If there are linked SARs, include their references as well. And glossary codes are really, really helpful as well. But there might be rare situations where they don't all suit. A resource showing the glossary codes will be made available on our on-demand page after this webinar. It's really important that you give the NCA the context. Firms should explain who they are and what services they are offering to who. And company particulars are also really important to help the UK FIU identify companies, such as, their unique company numbers as lodged with Companies House. And, if there are other companies or service providers involved, it's always important to just say who they are. So on how to submit a SAR, as I mentioned, you should enter as much identifying information as possible in your SAR. And this is data you will have gathered from, initial client contact or due diligence that you performed. Sending attachments into the FIU is actively discouraged, I should mention, and all the intelligence that FIU needs should be within the SAR submission itself. So they don't want any kind of additional documents via email. They should all be in the SAR submission that you're sending via SARS Online. Contact details can be entered into the SAR for any person or business that might have helpful further information on the SAR subject. And as I say, the UK FIU might use those to actually make contact with them. So now on how to submit a SAR narrative. So this is, the big bit at the end of SARS Online. So as I mentioned, start with a glossary code to enable the SAR to be triaged by the UK FIU, so they can pass it to the right department to look after that sort of crime. Then provide an overview, get into the key elements of the reasons for your suspicion. And this should be followed with specific detail explaining the transaction, the parties involved, and the actual reasons for suspicion in detail. If you've got additional details on subjects or criminal acts that might be useful, it's worth including that in there as well. You should always conclude the SAR with your intended action as regards to subjects, such as exiting the client relationship, monitoring the customer, or continuing to work for them. So key parts of a narrative include the reasons for suspicion. Obviously, they're really important, and if they aren't present, the SAR might just be closed by the NCA and they'll notify you via email. You must clearly describe what you consider to be criminal property. If you're raising a defense SAR, you must, of course, describe the prohibited acts you're intending to go through with. And then moving on to other key parts of the narrative, always include as much detail on the other parties as I mentioned, be they, professionals or criminal associates. And also the NCA are very keen on any information that could assist with identifying the subjects and where they actually are. So as I said, if you've got a general idea, it's worth including this information in your narrative. So some narrative tips now, and these are specific to the legal sector. Trying to tell a concise, straightforward story that's easy to understand. Try not to use legalese or acronyms. Tell the story chronologically and try not to put it in one big lump of text. Do use spaces and paragraphs. Also, you use upper and lower case and punctuation. Don't put it all in capitals in one big block. And this, of course, helps the UK FIU in reading, understanding, and appropriately triaging the hundreds of SARS submissions it receives each day. It's going to go through lots of people who need to understand it quickly and promptly. Just spell it out in that way, and it should be dealt with swiftly. So I'm going to move on to some examples now of narratives. These are real life examples, and I think you can see on screen a bad example of narrative. Now I won't read this out, but hopefully you can see it and it's big enough on your screens. As I say, this is an anonymized real life example from the legal sector. So there are key stylistic problems here, making this difficult to read for investigators and their automated analysis tools. Also, you might be able to see that there's no real description of what they consider to be the criminal property. They don't describe what they're actually doing for their clients. They don't give the location or the value of the property, and they don't give concrete reasons for suspicion. We can't see what data might have been given earlier in the info fields, like earlier on in SARS Online, but it's fair to say that the narrative itself isn't very specific. So moving on to a good example. Again, this is a real life anonymized SAR example, and this time it's a DAML SAR. Again, I won't read it out, but I'll describe its content, so you will be able to access the slides online afterwards in our on-demand pages. So this one starts with a glossary code, which enables the FIU to categorize the SAR by crime, and gives a headline overview of the issues at hand at the start of the narrative, and a description of the current instruction. And then the reporter describes the findings from due diligence concerning the subjects involved and their previous crimes, and also a detailed description of the documentary evidence seen in the due diligence is also provided. And then at the end of it, they also provide a detailed specific description of the prohibited act that they're seeking a defense against, describing each part of the transaction and how they seek to conclude the matter. So I hope you find these examples useful, but as I say, don't worry, a copy of these will be available on our on-demand page, so you can take another detailed read through them. Okay, now I'll hand back to Curran to talk about some SAR success stories. Over to you, Curran.
Thanks, Andrew. So we'll look at some of the outcomes from SARs, and we'll have a look at example one. The examples before you are an overall snapshot of what SAR intelligence has achieved. I think in this example, the UK FIU, I'm not sure if you can see it on our screens. I think we might just have a bit of a freeze there. In any case, I'm sure we'll catch up. The examples before before you is one where the reporting entity wished to return funds back to the subject, who was linked to sales of cannabis and illegal synthetic drugs. The monies were suspected to be the proceeds of crime, and the UKFIU refused defence, which then blocked the transaction, and law enforcement partner was able to achieve a restraint order in the process. It's a fine example of where someone's seeking an active defence against money laundering because they believe their client might be money laundering, and the UKFIU is able to disrupt that transaction. Having a look at example 2, which should come up on your screen shortly, this is one that's close to heart because it's one that I was involved in. And speaking more specifically about this one, I think it's a prime case study describing intelligence building and how one SAR could be part of a bigger puzzle. In this case, we received a defence against money laundering SAR from a reporter who was seeking a defence to pay away just shy of £700,000. My UKFIU colleagues conducted checks. We analysed the information and identified enforcement interest from Guernsey. With the wider law enforcement community, a coordinated response led to account freezing orders for 8 UK bank accounts that were identified in the subject's name, valued at £2.6 million from the initial 700,000. So I think both of those examples show you that actually intelligence building may not just be your SAR. We will always look at the wider picture to see what kind of action we can take. Finally, on a holistic level, looking at typologies in the SAR data allows law enforcement to undertake checks on money laundering risks and find ways to shut down organised criminal activity through legislative change. The landscape has dramatically changed since process of crime was introduced in 2002, and it continues to evolve as criminals adapt to measures taken. So I hope this demonstrates today the value behind the time you spend putting SARs into the UKFIU, where you do have a suspicion, and more importantly, help you understand what we do with the information. A quick plea from me before we finish off today. I'd like to invite you to take part in an engagement survey. So very shortly, you'll see a QR code come up on your screen. The engagement survey asks you a range of questions so we can understand as a UKFIU how we're currently supporting reporters and the impact of changes being made over the last 12 months. Your responses will be used to understand how the UKFIU can continue to improve the way we work with the regulated sector. It takes 5 minutes, it's anonymous, you can access via your smartphones now by scanning the QR code through your camera app. It will take you straight through to the survey, and I'd really appreciate if you can take some time to fill this in. Thank you very much. Handing back to you, Mark.
Thank you, Kuram, and thank you, Andrew, also. That was really, really interesting. Before we wrap up today, we do actually have some questions that have come in. So I might see if you can field those. The first question I have, and I might direct this to Kuram, where can I find the SAR glossary codes?
Thanks, Mark. So SAR glossary codes are available via the NCA website, but my colleague will circulate a link after this webinar via email so you can access the attachments. If you're ever unsure, please always go to the NCA website first. We have a guidance section and everything will go there. So I'm happy to give the link after this webinar. I think we've also had a question come through about what glossary codes actually are. So if you don't mind, Mark, I'll explain that before we move on. Glossary codes are different to NCA alert codes. They match a certain typology. So let's just say you're returning funds to a victim. There is a code for that for you to use, and it helps the NCA on a holistic level look at the data by searching for those codes to see what the volume of reporting is like, so we can understand where to tackle our resources. So that's what a glossary code is, and that's where it's available.
Great, thank you very much. Next question I have here is, what is the difference between a DAML, Defense Against Money Laundering, and an information SAR, and how do I make that choice in SARs online? Maybe one for you, Andrew?
Okay, thanks, Mark. So the difference between them is one, to seek a defence against one of the key money laundering offences of the Proceeds of Crime Act, and the other is to provide information to the NCA. So one is provided, on a kind of information intelligence basis, where you're not expecting anything in return, you're just volunteering information to the NCA. Where the other is where you wish to proceed with a transaction where you feel you may be handling tainted funds. And within SARs online, the way of kind of differentiating your submission to the NCA. There's a little tick box in one of the earlier pages where you tick if you're seeking a consent or not. If you tick that, obviously you will submit a DAML. If you don't, you will submit an information SAR to the NCA.
Great, thank you, Andrew. I think that might be it in terms of time for today. So again, just to say thank you to Andrew and Kuram both, and just a few things to flag before we totally wrap up. I want to thank everybody for attending today. Hope you found it interesting. Also to just flag, as I think has been mentioned, a recording of the event will be available on our on-demand page, along with the slides used by both individuals. And just to remind you to have a look on our events page for future webinars. Also to say we really appreciate feedback on these events and what we could do better, or other topics of interest you might want to hear events about. So please do use the link and let us know how you found the session. There will be, as I say, a follow-up email with some helpful links, and more resources are available on the on-demand page. So finally, thanks again to Kuram and Andrew for your time, and thanks to everybody for joining us today and watching. And yeah, thank you all and have a good day.